that issue is stop and frisk. The much criticized police pat-down has been a topic of debate for years. Stop and frisk allows a police officer to stop and question someone if the officer has a, quote, reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. Police can then do a pat-down if they believe the person is armed. Well, how the procedure has been used over the years, though, has raised legal issues, including concerns of racial profiling, causing tension between police and communities of color. Philadelphia City Council President Darrell Clark brought stop and frisk up after the July 4th shooting on the Parkway. Clark suggested a conversation about the tactic, prompting immediate pushback. NBC10's Lauren Make has more.
There are a couple of controversial issues that we have to have a conversation about.
Council President Darrell Clark talking about strategies to address the city's gun violence, now suggesting a conversation about a controversial one.
At the end of the day, there are a lot of citizens in the streets of the city of Philadelphia that talk about when are we going to look at stop and frisk in a constitutionally enacted way. Those are conversations that people have to have.
The city's history with the policing tactic goes back decades and includes a lawsuit that led to changes in policing.
The city is essentially under a consent decree to reduce the overall numbers of stop and frisk and also reduce or eliminate racial disparities in the stop and frisk.
Robert Kane is a professor and department head of criminology and justice studies at Drexel University.
Is there a constitutional way where a stop and frisk is appropriate?
It's hard to know, to be honest with you, because frankly, I haven't seen one yet.
It needs a different name, right? Because sometimes you need to change the name, because the reality is that when you reference stop and frisk, it has a negative connotation.
Now, Council President Clark declined our request to come on and have a conversation about stop and frisk and instead sent us his recent op-ed published in the Inquirer titled, "We need to talk about stop and frisk," says City Council President. In this article, Clark says, quote, "There needs to be a conversation about stop and frisk as practiced constitutionally," meaning a police officer must have a reasonable suspicion before stopping anyone. He adds, quote, "No one is advocating a return to the controversial days when police singled out people because of how they look or dress." With me now is Philadelphia Councilmember Isaiah Thomas. The Democrat is an at-large council member. Now, he's against the idea of bringing back stop and frisk, and this week he wrote an op-ed in the Inquirer spelling out exactly why. Thank you for being here, Councilman Thomas.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it, and I appreciate my voice being included in this conversation.
Absolutely. Now, in the editorial you wrote, you said that you've been stopped by police more times than you can count over the course of your life. I'm curious, how would you describe those experiences?
Sure. For me, again, I've been stopped more times than I realize, and the experience varies depending on who pulled you over, who you're with, and the circumstances that you were essentially pulled over for. There's been times where I fit the description of something that had taken place, and I was pulled over and the officers treated me fair, they were just, and they let me go. There were other times where I was a pedestrian walking down the street and I looked guilty and I feel like my civil rights were violated. There's been other times when I've been pulled over in a vehicle and the officers weren't necessarily polite. I feel like my civil rights were violated, and it put me in a position where the process of being searched, the process of being accused of something that you didn't do can often be humiliating and demoralizing. So I think I've experienced it from a number of different views as it relates to what I've gone through, who I was with, as well as the overall outcome of that specific stop.
Now, Councilmember, as we just spoke about, Council President Darrell Clark brought up this most recent debate on stop and frisk, and he said that constituents have asked him to bring up this conversation about the policy. I'm curious, have you heard Philly residents asking to talk more about stop and frisk?
Yes, I think that it is a common thing for people to want to bring up tactics like stop and frisk. And when you look at the crime issue that we have in the city of Philadelphia, people are frustrated. I'm frustrated. And sometimes what happens is that frustration puts you in a position where you're willing to try anything to be able to address some of the catastrophes that we see in Philadelphia on a consistent basis. So I understand the intention behind what people are asking for. I also think that it's important that we have clarity, because there are situations where people are stopped, where cars are frisked, where probable cause does come into play, and police are looking to do their job. So I think that it is an important conversation. And I think the important part about this conversation is that the constituents of Philadelphia know what's going on in their city. They understand how their communities are being policed, and they recognize that we are doing everything that we can to try to address some of the crime that we see in the city of Philadelphia.
Well, so let's get into a little more then. So in the council president's op-ed, he argued when stop and frisk and other tactics were used, 10 years ago, in more serious way under the Nutter administration, it made the city safer. What is your take on that argument?
Well, I don't necessarily know if that's what made the city safer. I think that during that time, we were in a different space that is pre-COVID. We were also dealing with a lot of different issues that we're not necessarily faced with right now, like the use of social media, the idea of ghost guns being as common as they are. I think these things have changed the conversation as it relates to crime, as it relates to some of the issues that we face here in the city of Philadelphia. And I think for us, it's important that as time changes, as people become more innovative, as technology begins to influence the culture and how we live, I think that we as elected officials have to be just as innovative as what the time currently dictates. So for me, I'm not necessarily a big fan of that tactic because I was one of the young people who grew up at a time when it was really prevalent. And I know what it means to be racially profiled on a consistent basis by police. And I also think that when it's implemented the wrong way, it puts us in a position where it creates a ripple of problems that we don't necessarily think about because we're worried about the current state that we're in right now and not necessarily the impact things have later on down the line. So I commend everybody for their efforts to try to do whatever we can to address the crime that we have in the city of Philadelphia. I'm always welcome to any suggestions, ideas, or recommendations. When I recommended driving equality, everybody wasn't necessarily a fan of it, but I appreciate everybody's willingness to come to the table and compromise. And even though I'm not a fan of unconstitutional stop and frisk practices, I'm always willing to come to the table to discuss what can we do to address some of the crime we see in the city of Philadelphia, even if it's a tactic that I don't agree with on the surface.
Well, I'm going to talk about driving equality in just a moment, but I just want to drill down on this, council member. From your perspective, do you see any way stop and frisk can work without being racially discriminatory?
Well, if it's not racially discriminatory, then it's not stop and frisk. That's how I feel. When I think about stop and frisk, I think about giving law enforcement the power and the ability to look at someone and say that they look guilty and search and frisk that person. If that's not where, I don't know a version of stop and frisk that's not discriminatory as it relates to implementation practice by police. Now, when you're talking about an individual situation, when police may have probable cause, or if somebody violated a motor vehicle code violation and they're pulled over and they end up frisking or searching the car, depending on the term that law enforcement is using based on what they're actually looking for, well, then that's a little different. And I wouldn't call that stop and frisk. I would call that police officers doing their job. So when I see stop and frisk and when I hear about stop and frisk, I think about law enforcement having the ability to look at someone and determine that they look guilty, and that be enough probable cause in itself to be able to search somebody. And that is something that I would not be a fan of.
Now, Councilmember, we just have a few moments left, but I got to ask this question, and I think this is one of the questions that a lot of folks in Philadelphia have had. Why was this brought up now, in your view? Because it seems, frankly, in conflict with a lot of the driving equality legislation that, passed less than a year ago and is now first taking effect in Philadelphia.
I think that it was brought up first and foremost to explain to people what is currently happening with Cherry stops in the city of Philadelphia, so that people understand that our police department is working. They are looking to do their best to enforce the laws to at least the best of our knowledge as members of city council, and also to let people know that we care. I think that some of these recommendations sometimes come out of a great place. I work with a lot of these folks in council, as well as some of our partners who are very passionate about the crime and the violence that we're seeing in the city of Philadelphia. And we are hearing constituents on a consistent basis call for a lot more stricter activity, whether we agree with it or not. So I do agree with the fact that it's important that we have a conversation. What better time than the present when we look at the number of homicides that we've seen specifically in the month of July, the number of young people that we know are moving around and operating in our streets without positive activity and positive program. And so I understand where it's coming from. I completely respect everyone's intentions.
Philadelphia City Council member Isaiah Thomas, thank you so much for your time. We'll talk soon.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.